Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is the place where we talk all things strange and unexpected in our reality. Today's episode is from our Halloween collection, 2024, and it's an interview episode. And my guest today is Varla Ventura. She's an author of a number of books hitting topics like paranormal, ghosts, hauntings, enchanted realms, mermaids, bizarre, freaky, and frightening facts, and creatures of the night. She is a lover of bizarre and strange things. And she spends her time, and tell me if this is still true, lurking around lakes, diving for legends, and sailing the seven seas in search of an elusive story. Is that true? Still?
Always true. Always
Perfect.
true.
Perfect. And the first thing I thought of was, man, she's a perfect guest for this show. So I'm glad to have Varla here today, who's going to help us learn about some things that maybe we haven't heard before. So I'm pretty excited about that. So welcome, Varla, and how are you doing today?
Wonderful. I feel right at home amongst high strangeness.
Right.
It's kind of my forte, so I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. Now, Varla, where are you joining us from today?
I live in Minnesota now. I live outside of St. Paul.
Perfect. Are you loving it out there? Is it still pretty hot?
It's been I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area primarily, and so it was quite a shift from that. But everything's a new adventure, and I'm enjoying it. It's given me a lot more time to write. So just in moving here 8 years ago, I'm on my third book, which
Nice.
Maybe doesn't sound like that. Actually, I'm on my fourth book, which, so it's about like one every 2 years, which is really not bad for, some writers can really crank it out, but I'm not one of those. So I've been able to spend more time writing, which is really important to me. So that was a big reason for the shift, to kind of get out of the rigmarole or the rat race of living in a big city. Yeah.
And so the place you're at now is perfect for you to get into that moment where you need to be to...
Yeah, I mean, nowhere's really perfect, that I do love to travel, so that's one of my main sources of inspiration, where I get a lot of my story ideas and where I do a lot of research. So kind of like right in the middle of the country. It's very easy to get east, west, north, south, wherever you need to go.
Sure. Well, hey, listen, I'm excited to get into this today, but before we get into this, I always love to hear as much as we can about the author, like how they got to this point, like what's their life like, what do they do, and then what got them into this crazy stuff that they're into, and even to write some of these books. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up kind of in a somewhat unconventional environment. My mom's a witch, so a practicing witch.
Wow.
So don't mess with me.
Yeah, right.
So I think that I didn't really think that anything of that until I was sort of a bit older, and I realized, not everybody has a mom that goes to like goddess circles on the full moon, but actually quite a few of my friends did in this area, this kind of rural part of Northern California where we had moved from the Bay Area too. So it was a little less unusual in that area, but in the grand scheme of things, I can count on one hand the number of times I've attended church services, and of all of those, most of them have been for funerals. So I'm not saying that to disparage church. I'm just saying that the norm for me was going to like goddess circles and rituals from a young age. So I think that had a lot of influence on my interests. My mother had always a lot of occult books on her bookshelf, and we played with Ouija boards and did tarot and astrology from a very young age. So And then the other big influence for me is that, and this all of my siblings really love a good cemetery. We have all spent, days in our childhood wandering through cemeteries. And what we used to do is we used to actually like picnic in cemeteries, and we would walk around and we would make up the stories about the people who were buried there. Sometimes you would know something about them because, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's some really famous and infamous graves, so you kind of know a little something about them. But sometimes you just be like, oh, look, this family is here, and then you match the names, and we would just kind of make up stories. So I think that sort of lent, sort of segued for me into, it's a somewhat gothic teenage years, and just generally really appreciating. I grew up with a lot of lore and fairy tales. Studying a lot about plants and things like that. So, just kind of like a witchy aesthetic growing up.
Wow.
So I think that really influenced my love of monsters. And I think some of us are also just wired that way. Like, I remember just always falling in love with the villains in like even in like the Disney tales. It was like I always liked the villains. I always found myself rooting for the villains. I was like, let's go, Captain Hook. I'll go on your ship. And I think that so I just think some people are kind of wired to like sort of like those things. And I love ghost hunting, cemeteries. All of those things are very joyful for me.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the misnomer. People hear those things and they think it's scary, or and it can be scary, but I like to be scared. So
right.
That's the other thing. And I know I'm not alone in that. I know that there's probably a lot of people listening right now, like waving their hands, like, yeah, me too. So I just got lucky enough that I was working on a book idea, and I actually was working at the publisher as an intern at the time. And this other editor and I sat down and Rachel, she and I, we sat down and we came up with this. I was like, we should do a Halloween book. I didn't really know what that meant, but I wanted to do something that was Halloween-y. And the publisher was like, what did you have in mind? And we came up with this idea for the Book of the Bizarre, which is the first book, and it's just like this treasure trove of weird trivia and stories of strange coincidences and people's ghost encounters. It was like just like a rag bag of like the kind of things you'd read in Ripley's Believe It or Not, or those kind of books. I loved those when I was a kid. Meets facts, meets ghost stories, and that was very successful. And so out of that, we went on to do the Beyond Bazaar, and then the book that we'll talk more about tonight is Banshees, Werewolves, and Vampires. I also wrote a book about mermaids. I wrote a book all about the fairy kingdom, and then most recently, well, not most recently, but the most recently published book is all about paranormal encounters and paranormal lore and history. And so that. And then I have another book coming out in April. So I just kind of got lucky that I was able to put things that I loved to a thing that I was also always very comfortable in, and that was writing. I was one of those kids that we'd sit down and we'd do the observational writing, and I'd be 10 pages. I'm not exaggerating. I'd be 10 pages. And all the other kids would be like, can we go play on the playground now? And I'd still be sitting there writing, because I would have come up with a story idea somewhere in there. And so I was, they would just leave me. I was like, yeah, you can just sit here and stay on the bench. It's fine. It's not a punishment. So I just got lucky that those things I've been able to put those together. And being an author, it's a very humble means, unless you just really hit the big time, or you're able to do. There's certain genres that you can make a lot more money in. Obscure, occult, and paranormal is not one of them. But I've been able to supplement the book writing with other writing, writing articles and working on other people's books as a developmental editor and things like that. So I've been able to really put myself into a real writing life, and that does come with, some of that comes with like moving to the Midwest and being able to have the space to not have to scramble to pay rent and childcare and all of those bus and taxis and all the things that you need. And so I just walk everywhere now.
Right. Well, that sounds amazing. And backing up a little bit, when you were talking about your upbringing, it's interesting, and I almost want to interview you about that, because that's really interesting. I don't know a lot of people that have gone through that. And you have a very positive experience that you had from all that, which is amazing. I actually interviewed somebody recently who was talking to me about, it was just a side note, but they mentioned voodoo, and they described it as a very loving religion. And I was like, really?
Oh yeah.
It's the first time I'd ever heard that.
Oh yeah, I know, because it gets this reputation for being all about hexes, or really all about curses, not hexing. You don't really hex in voodoo, but curses, and there's the association with zombies and bringing people back from the dead, and as with any religion, there's extremes, and there's also a lot of rumors. And I think that because what we know of voodoo comes from, unless we actually listen to people who practice voodoo, as you did, a lot of what is sort of recorded in terms of the historical record comes from colonizers having absolutely no idea what's going on, not understanding the language, and perceiving something as primitive or sacrificial, when in fact it was not at all. Also, I think the thing, and I don't practice voodoo because it's not of my heritage, but I have read about it and worked with a couple of authors who are voodoo practitioners, and so I'm moderately familiar with it. And what I think is very important about it that people really don't understand is the community aspect of it. That magic and ritual is done. You could say this is true about any kind of witchcraft, but really in voodoo, it's about the greater good. Most of the time, and even the things that might be done for the protection are done for the protection, say for the protection of children or people who can't defend themselves. I think it is a very loving religion. I love that that's how it was described. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this is why I love chatting with people, because I learn stuff every single time. Because we get programmed as we're growing up with all kinds of information, and there's nothing better than peeling that back and seeing things differently or for the first time. So I think it's really cool.
So true. It's so true. And I have a 13-year-old son also, so it's always kind of funny when like he and his friends are hanging out and they say something that you just know is just some like absolute child rumor that someone started, that this is like absolutely not true, and you kind of get to have that, like, you tease them a little bit, but like the whole like saying Bloody Mary into the mirror, or just ridiculous things like, oh, did you know there's a pool? There used to be a pool on the roof of the school. It's like all these kind of like really funny things that absolutely aren't true, but you kind of get to see that, like, the beginnings of those things, and correct it a little bit if you can, just to remind people to listen to others and also do your own research. Just making up like crazy things because you heard that a teacher said that. It's like, well, let's learn about first-hand sources, kid.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll tell you, the titles you just rattled off a few minutes back, I think every one of them are so interesting and sounds like so much fun to read. So, people, check these out. These are they sound very good. I know I'm going to grab some of those books.
And all my titles are very long. So whenever I submit a bio for an interview, I try and like put them on completely different like lines, just because it's hard to tell like some of the titles, and then they all have these like really alliterative subtitles, and they're quite ridiculous, but I like it that way. So, and the publisher doesn't mind. So,
yeah. Well, let me ask you this. You know, across this country, we're very used to, you know, different kinds of stories, werewolves, vampires, and different variations of those couple or three, animals, beasts, whatever you want to call them. I have a question for you. What is a banshee? What is a banshee?
yeah. Oh, banshees are my favorite. Yeah. Well, there's a book that I wrote called Banshees, Werewolves, and Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night. And I honestly, I still lord this over him to this day. But my publisher at the time he wanted to have vampires first. And I said, everybody's doing vampires.
Yeah.
Like, everybody's got a book about, within my little world, everybody's got a book about vampires. But no one has a book about our banshees.
Yeah.
So we kind of compromised. So we put banshees first in there. But to your point, or to answer your question, a banshee, the word banshee actually translates literally to like woman of the fairy mound. And banshees are very interesting. They are sort of straddle the world between ghosts and the fairy kingdom. The word banshee is an Irish word, and essentially it describes what we might think of as a wailing woman. Oh. And I'll explain some counterparts to the banshee in a moment. But the Irish banshee, the traditional banshee, is usually seen, sometimes only heard, sometimes both, and is known by a very loud, sort of horrifyingly mournful wail. This wailing sound is the indication that somebody is going to die. So it was frequently heard, if there was someone who was sick in a village, you would hear the banshee cry, and then you would know that they weren't going to make it through the night. So it's particularly terrifying because unlike many of the other sort of supernatural creatures out there, the banshee sort of portends the death, and it could be of someone that you love. So it can be a very, sort of a heart-wrenching thing to witness.
Yeah.
There are many, many layers to the banshee. Like, that's the very, umbrella explanation. Frequently, banshees are, actually, I believe the traditional banshee, to my knowledge, there's never been one described as male. They've always been sort of a female entity. And they are often either a little, sort of like little old, harmless-looking woman, or a very beautiful woman, but with something a little bit off, and then they can transform. So frequently described as like a floating head with like crazy long black hair that are like tendrils, and with a giant gaping black mouth and dark eyes. But also you might encounter a banshee if you were walking home at dusk and there was a little old lady sort of, hobbling down the road, and then she would transform into a banshee and, start that scream or that cry. So that's essentially a banshee. Really, they're harmless in some ways, right? It's a warning ghost. They don't cause death. Although there are a few accounts of people being so scared when they see a banshee, they run off a cliff. But they don't necessarily cause death or harm. They just sort of tell you of it. So they're kind of warning you that it's coming. And in some ways, I think they're sort of calling in the spirits of the dead to take the living away. So there's a term called a psychopomp, and a psychopomp is a creature, an entity, god or goddess, or usually not actually a quite elevated to deity status. So usually not a god or goddess, but some kind of otherworldly being that helps people move from the world of the living to the world of the dead. So, for example, the guy who rows you across it's Chiron, I think, who rows you across the river Styx. I think that's who it is. He's a psychopomp. He's getting you to the land of dead. The Valkyries in Norse mythology, who descend upon the battlefield and decide who's going to Valhalla, they're psychopomps. I think mermaids are psychopomps, frequently seen to, kind of swirl around a sinking ship and help guide the souls of the dead sailors to their watery graves or transcend the mortal plane. So Banshees are sort of in that category as well, at least in my view.
Yeah.
There are some people that will say a banshee is Irish, and they really do come from Irish the fairy mythology. But there are also, like anything, especially in the fairy realm, there are counterparts. So different names, somewhat different characteristics, but overall sort of the same idea in many different parts of the world. So for example, in Italy, there's a woman in white that appears especially in like the castles of some of the traditionally wealthier Italian families. And this woman in white appears as this sort of ghostly figure and is usually crying, and this is an indication that somebody in the family is going to die. Similar stories like that. There's a washerwoman who, if seen before you go out onto the battlefield, she's seen washing bloody rags in a creek, and if you see that, that means you're probably not going to make it through that battle. So there are many sort of counterparts to what you would call a traditional banshee. And then the other really interesting thing about banshees, and this is obviously just sort of one of those somewhat unanswerable questions. Some people, so traditionally there were clans in Ireland, and each of those clans sort of had like their territory and their beautiful castle or whatever. And as the clans or the chieftains sort of like began to sort of expand out and intermarry, the sort of banshees spread out. So some people say that banshees are attached to specific places, and there certainly are banshees that are attached to places. Others say that banshees are attached to a specific family. For example, there's an O'Donnell banshee. And I've always wondered, the $1 million question, are you inheriting the banshee, or are you inheriting the ability to see the banshee?
Yeah.
And could somebody else perhaps marry into the family who has that sort of second sight, then also witness the banshee, or a distant relative who isn't in the physical place witness the banshee? And there's all kinds of examples of both of those things. So it's a very interesting prospect. And I'm going to apologize to you if you hear a dog barking in the background. I have a puppy. I have good headphones in, but sometimes she just
I haven't heard it, so
it's
perfect. Yeah, that's great.
got a banshee of my own here.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I really didn't know much about a banshee, and that's pretty cool. I mean, I'll be keeping an eye out for that, like if I run across something like that again, because that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that may come to mind also, people may be familiar with La Llorona, who is sort of that dark-haired woman that can be seen wandering along roads in Mexico. And that's part of Mexican folklore, and she does something very similar. She can sort of like terrify you. And the other thing about banshees, and sort of the washerwoman kind of comes into play here as well, but certainly La Llorona comes into play. that is the idea that they were women who died. Some believe they're women who died in childbirth, or whose children died for whatever reason. They may have had postpartum, whatever. Kind of. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it, and they are sort of like doomed to stay in this limbo state where they warn others when death is coming, because they weren't warned. That's sort of a nice-ish way of looking at it. But with all the fairy and folk tales and traditional beliefs, and when I say mythology, please don't misunderstand that I think that these are things that are just made up. Right. I think mythology is an umbrella term for original stories, basically.
Yeah.
But I think that, like all of those kind of original stories, you have a lot of different interpretations, but at their core, you'll find something very similar. And you'll see that throughout the fairy lexicon in particular. You'll have something that is, for example, there's trickster fairies, cross-culturally. There are trickster fairies.
Yeah.
There are water spirits. There are mountain dwellers. There are tree spirits. So, it's actually something that I find endlessly fascinating.
Yeah.
As learning about different sort of creatures and then seeing the connection between them. Always very interesting. I had when I was writing the book about only about fairies, it's kind of about the fairy kingdom in itself and sort of the darker side of it. I kept finding all of these stories about like little hobgoblins and things that were in a domestic setting, and these children who would complain, they would wake up and they'd have like they'd been pinched, and objects would move around the room, or they'd have scratches, or things would go missing. And I kept thinking, boy, that sure sounds like a poltergeist.
Right.
It was just there were so many stories that were so similar, and it just really got me thinking, are we describing the same? Are we talking about the same thing, but we have different vocabulary? Or are they actually completely different? I mean, there was just a lot of overlaps. Also, some like alien abduction stories overlap a lot with the idea of like falling asleep on the fairy mound and going into kind of like another time and having like confused memories about it, and then waking up and all of this time has lapsed and you're wandering around emaciated in the forest. Everyone's wondering where you've been for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's a little bit like alien abduction.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Varla, I think it's funny that you bring that up because, I'm into that as well. And I dive into all these different things. And what's amazing to me is I'm seeing connections. And I'm seeing over time we interpret maybe the same things different ways just because of culture and time in history and stuff. So it's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And in the modern era, we like to spend a lot of time looking for proof. Sometimes at the risk of not seeing what's right in front of us.
Right.
So it is a different approach. I mean, we are in a completely different era than we were 100 years ago or 200 years ago in terms of the way that we can get information, the way that we can stay connected. Yeah. I remember being a little kid and thinking, my sister and I kind of like laying there together and thinking, like, wouldn't it be so cool if we had like a little handheld TV that we could just have in our room and we could watch it anytime we wanted? And then the other day she said to me, remember when we were kids and we wanted a tiny little TV to have at all times? And she like held up her cell phone.
Yeah.
She's like, we have that.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've thought about that before too. Oh, that's crazy. Well, it's interesting talking about seeing what's in front of you. I'll just divert for a quick second. So as a kid, as a young person, I used to see a lot of things. I don't mean spirits or stuff, but I just see a lot of strange things, and people would just walk by it like it was nothing. But I'd be like, why is that? That doesn't whoa, did you see that? I would do that all the time. And, I got into life, and you wind up falling in line with all the things that people do. But a few years back, I had gotten cancer, and I was fighting it for about 3 years, and I'd been in the hospital for a while. So I'd sit at my window when I could and look out and watch the world, and I started seeing stuff again. And so after I got out and finished my treatment, I thought to myself, I'm going to do a podcast about strange things because it's all around us, and I'm starting to see it again. And so that's why I love what you said, because it's so true. It's everywhere. There's so many strange.
I feel, well, first of all, I'm happy that you're in recovery. That's wonderful. Thank you. And yes, there's nothing like a good old-fashioned hospitalization to really put things into perspective. And I've been there myself a couple of times in the last few years, and it really forces you to slow down. You get to a point where you're sick of your phone. You can't bear any of that.
Yeah.
And I personally have noticed, and I've noticed it kind of on high for the last maybe 6 months in particular. And I don't know why this I feel like there's something maybe astrologically or something going on, but I've noticed coincidental signs kind of amping up. And what I mean by that is a word that you you've never seen before. You're reading a book, the word appears, and then a few hours later somebody uses it in a sentence, completely unrelated, and then you see it on a billboard or something like that. So I've noticed some things like that, and I started noticing it a few months ago in particular when I have multiple tarot decks, and I would pull 4 different cards, and I'd get 3 of the same card across different decks. Wow. I've noticed that kick up a lot in the last couple of months as well. And I read a book when I was probably 18. I read this book called The Secret Language of Signs. And it's a wonderful book. And in it, basically, it's not necessarily a magic book. It's sort of a book about paying attention and being able to then use those signs like the universe is telling you something. And so her example was, it could be anything. It could be somebody keeps saying an expression, like, get off my back, get off my back. It's just like something that somebody says all the time. And they're actually don't realize that they're having back issues. Or you might be walking down the street and you see a playing card and it's got a number on it. And then that number comes up on your, you get all 2s on your receipt. And then, so little things like that. And it really opened my eyes to be paying attention to those sort of overlaps and those coincidences. And then think about, I think it's just kind of fun to think about what could this mean?
Yeah.
But I've just noticed a lot of that lately, to the point where it's not that I'm not observing it, but I'm almost sort of expecting it now.
Right.
Okay, all right, today is the day that 4 people are going to contact me about photographing a cemetery. Just something very sort of out of the, not totally out of the blue, but not expected. And I've noticed that a lot. So I'd be curious when people are listening if they've been experiencing anything like that as well. Because I do think that, I don't know, just something sort of energetically happening. And maybe it's just like could be personal to me, but pay attention.
Right.
I just feel that there's high magic afoot these days. So,
Maybe.
time will tell.
Yeah. I'm glad you said it because, I would be interested to see what people think because, not that I've talked about that to too many people, but I've heard a few people say things that sound like this. Like they're just seeing weird connections, or some people describe it as deja vu, but not really, those sorts of things,
Yeah,
So.
yeah, like you were, like you were expecting it, but you weren't really quite sure what you were expecting. But then when it happens, you're like, yeah, okay, that totally makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. And it's not necessarily, I think, yeah, it just seems to be happening a lot just in the last few months in particular. So I would be very curious when people listen to this around around Halloween, how they're, if they also feel high magic is afoot. I hope it is.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Only good can come of high magic.
Right. How about that? Okay, thank you for talking about Banshees, and this is, I'm loving this conversation because we're going a lot of places that I love, so this is great. A couple other weird or strange creatures, entities. What is a bogey, a changeling, a goblin, and a puka?
Okay. Well, let's start with changelings because they're the scariest. So, like Banshees are scary because they're kind of like inescapable, and they're sort of just like that reminder that, you know, death is nigh. Changelings are basically a fairy kidnapping. So a changeling is a fairy baby that has been switched with a human baby and has been raised by humans as if it were a human baby. Kind of a weird way of saying that, but that's essentially what a changeling is. Usually it's a child, it's usually a baby, but it could be a child, and also there are accounts of adults being changed out. And so it's usually a sort of like, it's not just a straight up stealing, there's usually something left in place. It's very, a very feared, changelings are also sometimes what people would call children who had any kind of abnormality. They would sort of immediately be pegged as a changeling, that they were from the fairy kingdom, they weren't quote unquote normal. So one thing I do like to mention is that anytime you're reading, especially like the folkloric record, it is largely recorded, was largely recorded and translated during the Victorian era by a bunch of like wealthy white dudes.
Yeah.
So, and they were also frequently men of the cloth, or you had some sort of religious upbringing, and that's because they were educated, and a lot of the education came in that way. And even William Butler Yeats, excellent example. His father was a reverend, quite a devout reverend, and then a lot of the schools were affiliated with churches. So that's again, not disparaging wealthy white men of the cloth, or wealthy white men / of the or men of the cloth. But it does lend a very specific lens to observations, as we mentioned before, Haitian voodoo and how it was observed by colonizers and completely, misconstrued. So you always have a little bit of that, and it's always important to think that in the folkloric record. And also, I find this a very interesting thing to do. Because you can kind of sift through, like, okay, there was this belief in changelings, and I believe there are some changelings among us, quite frankly. I think there are quite a few outstanding musicians who are changelings. And so a changeling means that you were raised, you are of the fairy kingdom originally, but you were raised in a human environment, and they frequently have some sort of remarkable gift, like an incredible artist, a voice that sounds like it's from another realm. So that's one kind of a changeling. You also have, as I said, there's a lot of examples where if a child was born with any kind of abnormality, which was quite common actually, and probably even more common than it is today, because women didn't have birth control, so they would just like keep having babies into their like 50s. And they didn't have a lot of maternal care. There's no like ultrasounds or anything like that.
Right.
So it just, it increased the chances that there might be something considered an abnormality by, the standards of the time. And so it's always important to remember that sometimes those things that weren't considered a regular person in society, they would be labeled as a changeling. Now, in some cultures, that was true, but they were revered. They were revered for their psychic abilities, or revered for their, thought to be more akin to God or the spirit realm. And therefore they were a gift, which I think is a much healthier way of treating people in general.
Yes.
But in summary, changelings were these like fairy babies that were left in place, and then your baby was taken away and raised in the fairy realm. And then they may also walk among you, but they would learn, like they would get the gifts of the fairy kingdom. So it's basically like a half and half kind of situation. And they were quite feared. Like there are all these stories. So fairies are supposed to, like iron is supposed to keep fairies at bay. So iron locks were frequently placed on like windows and doors in a birth chamber when a woman was giving birth. You had to make sure that all of the doors, drawers of a dresser, everything was completely sealed and locked when a woman was giving birth, so the fairies couldn't get in any portal, which actually has a very practical application as well, because you are preventing germs and dust and any kind of contamination, which you want a sterile environment when you're having a baby. So there's just a lot of interesting kind of lore around changelings and how to get them back. Like if you think your child's been stolen away, there are like these different remedies. Some very interesting ones come from Lady Wilde, who is Oscar Wilde's mother, and she was a bit of an occultist and absolutely like a folklorist and a believer in fairies. And she has there's quite a few books out there, but she's got collections of like how to deal with a changeling. And some of them are very gruesome. We don't need to really get into that. But I mean, even people may have even seen, there's a scene in Outlander actually where they take a baby who has, I don't know what they say is wrong with the baby, but they leave this baby out on a fairy hill. And the main character, she's like a healer and a doctor, and she's walking by and she's hearing this baby crying. And she wants to go and rescue it, and by doing so, she's labeled like a witch, just to even like mess with this child that's been left out, because they would leave it for the fairies, and they called it a changeling, as if the fairies had snuck in and switched the baby at birth. That was kind of the belief. So very interesting history there.
That is. I've never heard of that
Very layered.
before. That's so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Changing. I'm going to tell my kids sometimes they're a changeling. I'm going to say, you're changeling.
I mean, absolutely. Sometimes they are, They probably got a Banshee or two in there
right.
on occasion. Yeah. And then let's see what you asked about pukas. Love pukas. Pukas are my personal favorite. I love a good puka. Pukas are tricksters. So now I have been told a few times that especially in Ireland, that puka is more of a general term, can be used for any kind of fairy spirit, because in general, fairies love to play tricks. They're smarter than us. They just are.
Sure.
So it's very easy for them to outsmart us, and they delight in it. But a puka is a trickster fairy, a shapeshifter, frequently seen as a large rabbit or a horse with glowing eyes, and occasionally as a donkey. And sometimes there's even stories of like an eagle or another kind of large bird being a changeling, but most frequently it's a rabbit or a horse. And what the puka kind of serves to do, as with all trickster spirits, is sort of like take you just to the edge to set you right. So for example, should you find yourself out late at night, having had one too many, they love to play on to prey on town drunks. This is another very common thread with pukas, because they like to show themselves to people that no one will believe. Just because it also plays into the trickster element of whether or not they're real and whether or not this person is telling the truth. And the most famous puka is Harvey, as far as like one that what we may have heard of. And Harvey is the rabbit that Jimmy Stewart talks to in the like a 1940s movie. And his character, Elwood P. Dowd, talks to this giant rabbit that no one can see. And it's a stage play, actually, originally, Harvey. And is it Beckett? I can't remember. But in any case, he talks to he's a town drunk, and he's always embarrassing his sister, and he's talking to this rabbit, but this rabbit's actually telling him to do things and giving him advice and like teasing him. So the horse version is a lot more menacing. You'll see a horse with sort of like glowing black horse, flowing mane, glowing red eyes, very, very large horse, and can kind of flip you over onto its back and take you on this wild midnight ride across the moors until you're basically sure you're going to go over a cliff and then stop just short.
Right.
So should you encounter a puka in any form, it's usually a message that you need to reevaluate the choices you're making. And I think that that's why it's frequently associated, as I said, with like the town drunk who maybe stayed out, and why you're warned not to stay out so late and not take that road alongside the sea along the cliff. But they are kind of harmless. Again, like with the Banshees, they serve a purpose, and they also occasionally might cause you to go so mad that you jump off the cliff, but generally speaking, they aren't there to hurt you. They're just there to mess with you.
Yeah.
And one kind of interesting thing about the puka is that they, like as I said, they appear as a rabbit. And they can just as easily sort of like turn back into a rabbit. So here's this person raving, it's right over there, and then there's just this like little bunny hopping away. So with all, in particular, creatures of the fairy kingdom, there's always a transformative experience that happens when people witness a fairy, a cryptid, whatever kind of supernatural creature it is. It even happens with paranormal encounters with ghosts. There's a suspension of time. So a ghost will appear in the blink of a second. But when you retell it, that ghost story is 15 minutes long. It's a very suspenseful situation. So there's a little bit of a messing with time. I mean, fairies keep their own time. And so they do kind of mess around with your concept of time. So there's the transformational experience of not being sure of what you saw and doubting it, but also feeling like that experience happened for a really long period of time. Unlike with ghosts, because a lot of times, like for me, when I've seen things, my first instinct is that, that must have been like the wind, right? That's kind of like our first, like our rational mind kicks in, and then it becomes more obvious in another way. Or we're left going like, I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of that. With fairy encounters, it's different. It's much more like on the nose. It happens or it doesn't happen. Not unlike people might describe Bigfoot.
Right.
And then there was another creature you asked about. Now I can't remember what that was.
Mentioned goblins and pukas.
Oh yeah. Oh, so you're asking kind of about like goblins, or I think you had said also like bogies.
Bogies. That's
Yeah.
it.
So okay. So that's another one of those words that describes something that also sort of becomes something else in another language. So bogies are basically, that's sort of the origin of the word like boogeyman, right? It's sort of a supernatural fairy creature that lurks about. You can have a bogey, frequently bogey or boggles, they were sometimes called, were at the crossroads, and they might appear and sort of try and steer you in the wrong direction. So there's a little bit of a trickster element. But you also have bogies that live in homes and just sort of like lurk, sort of like the thing in the closet, you know, the thing under the bed. Those are also bogies. Now, the idea of like a bogeyman or a boogeyman sort of evolved from the warning element of a lot of these stories, you know, to protect children, both from supernatural and natural elements. The one way you're going to be sure to keep them from wandering into the bog is to point out that should they step too close, you know, this Jenny Greenteeth is going to reach out and pull them in, and then that's the end. So there's a warning element that also serves the, you know, entire culture as well, to sort of as protection. Now, I say that, but not to dismiss that I think that these things actually, that I don't think they're just warning tales.
Yeah.
So then you have a goblin. So it's interesting. Goblin is a very interesting word because in some cultures, what is described as a goblin is actually a very scary and menacing creature. And again, this can kind of come down to interpretation. There's one story that I can think of in particular that is about a goblin, and it was translated from the Japanese in like a Japanese tale in like 1900 by this very interesting woman who was a sort of a society lady, but she married a Japanese man and went and lived in Japan in the, you know, turn of the 20th century, and got very interested in the folklore and stories. And then she could speak Japanese, and so she translated quite a few of the stories. And there was a whole run from like 1890 to about 1930, where, you know, it was folk tales of Russia, folk tales of Japan, and they were also just sort of like published by a lot of the same publishers. You had all those fairy books by the Langs, and but in any case, so she has this story about a goblin that lives in the mountains, and it's basically like kind of almost like a Baba Yaga type thing. It lives, looks like a woman or a witch, and actually has a house full of bones, and takes somebody's wandering the road at night, and they see a light. They go up and say, it's a priest, of course, in this story. The priest goes up and says, can I stay with you? Can I take shelter for the night? And the person's like, I'd really rather you wouldn't. Well, there's nowhere else to go, and it's getting cold, and all right, you can, but stay here. I'm going to go and get wood for the fire. Whatever you do not open that door right there.
Which, of course.
So, of course, the old woman goes out into the woods to, quote unquote, gather firewood. Hours go by, and of course his curiosity gets the better of him, and he opens the door, and it's full of human bones that have, you know, clearly been consumed. And so he shuts the door and he runs out and narrowly escapes this goblin, and that's called like the Goblin of Adagachi. And it's a legend from that area of this sort of like witchy woman that's actually a goblin and likes to eat people. Not a cannibal, because technically not human. So that's one goblin. But then on the other hand, you have like the hobgoblin, which is actually a sort of a helpful goblin, or can be. A little bit of a trickster, likes to play tricks, but hobgoblins and bogies and brownies and dobbies, actually, which is where the little house elf's name comes from. That's a Scottish word for these little sort of like smaller domestic fairies that kind of hang out in barns and homes and kitchens especially. The domovoi is another one in the Ukrainian or Slavic folklore. And they hang out. They like to hang out around the stove a lot. They like to have. They like to keep things tidy. They look after animals and children. However, they have some requirements. You mustn't be lazy. If you're lazy, they'll curdle your milk and bring the pox. If you are a relatively neat person and you remember to leave an offering, a really nice offering every night, like good cake and wine or fresh cream. If you do that, they help you and protect your house and protect your spirits. So you sort of leave an offering. And to me, that sounds very much like Santa. You leave him milk and cookies, and he brings you great things. So, yeah.
That's awesome. You see the connections there a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for going into those. I learned a lot from those because I don't know much about any of those, actually, to be honest with you. But I know this is not part of your book, but I can't help it. I want to learn just a minute about mermaids. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I have an entire book just about mermaids.
Yeah.
Yeah, mermaids are very interesting. I think that we have a misunderstanding of mermaids, and I think that's perpetuated by 1980s Disney probably more than anything.
Right.
Maybe even like a little earlier than that. But mermaids are, in the Murrow certainly, are considered in Irish mythology. They are considered the ocean fairies, basically. So they totally fit in that kind of lexicon. And there are mermaid or mermaid-like creatures from around the world. There's even an island that has like a were-dolphin. So it's kind of like half wolfy, beastie creature, half dolphin. So there's all kinds of like these sort of hybrid sea creatures. But mermaids are the most common. Contrary to popular belief, they're not always maids. There are, I like to call them Murrow, and then you have your mermen and you have your mermaidens. But so we definitely have this idea that mermaids are, just sort of flitting about, and they're really pretty, and they just like to sit around on rocks and comb their hair. Some of that comes from the fact that in the Victorian era, mermaids, in Victorian era in particular, mermaids were used to sell hair products. So a lot of the imagery comes from like these sort of like an Irish moss sea product, or something that would be used to like make your hair grow, and there'd be pictures of mermaids. Interestingly, also kind of sidebar, but in Ireland, I believe there are 12 different churches that have mermaids in them.
Really?
They have these tiles that depict mermaids, or like a painting of a mermaid, and it's said that they were put in churches as a warning against vanity, mainly vanity, like they would be depicted with like an instrument and a mirror or something like that. But I think there's a little more to it, and actually there's a woman, an archaeologist, who has been studying these for a number of years, and I read an article that she wrote about sort of like the layers behind that in the places where these churches have mermaids, there's also a lot of mermaid lore from that area. And as we know, the church was really good at sort of superimposing a brand new holiday right on top of a pagan celebration, or what would have been a common celebration, so that they could get the butts in the seats, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, come on in. Yeah, we don't call it solstice. We call it Christ Mass. So come on in, though. We've got free cookies or whatever. Probably nothing's really free though, right? So anyway, mermaids are sort of, you get this idea that they're just kind of out there waiting to lure you in. Or maybe you have like the Mermaid Lagoon. That's in Peter Pan. There's the Mermaid Lagoon, and they are sort of enticing you to come into the water with them. So that is absolutely an aspect of mermaids. They have this trickster element. They do love to confuse and lure. They don't always understand that you can't breathe underwater, or maybe they don't care. So there are actually quite a few stories of mermaids marrying men that they can like the story of the Little Mermaid comes from this mythology, and that you can like basically live on land, but if you want to go back to the sea, you'll turn back into a mermaid. But the very first mermaid story, we believe, comes from this story, this Syrian story, and it was a goddess named Atragatis. And the story is that she accidentally killed the love of her life and was so ashamed that she accidentally killed him. I don't remember how, but it's kind of funny. Oops. And so she was so ashamed that she turned herself into a fish and dove into the water in this lake, actually, not in the sea. But then would like appear occasionally, especially like people would see her in the moonlight. And when she was emerged from the water, part of her would transform into the beautiful goddess that she was. So that's kind of where some of the mermaid stories come. But of course, like all island nations, Australia, New Zealand, there's big mermaid culture there. But yeah, again, like I do think that they are psychopomps. I think that they are there to kind of help with the transition should you drown at sea, whether they're the cause of your drowning or not. But I've also heard quite a few, and there's a few of them in my book, stories of fishermen or people who have spent a lot of time at sea actually being helped by mermaids. It got really foggy and they didn't know which way to go, and they followed the sound of the voice, and the voice was echoing off the rocks, so they knew which way harbor was. Also being able to offer in Aboriginal Australia, offering the mermaids and protecting the sea would then bring an abundance of fish and pearls and all of the things that you were harvesting. So there was a symbiotic relationship there. But there are some pretty dark mermaid stories for sure. And then of course you have the sea god. Manon, MacLear, was the son of the sea god, and he's the one who is said to have given the fairies the ability to cloak themselves with invisibility in order to protect themselves. And that's sometimes the equivalent of fog. So he would make the fog rise up from the sea, and it would surround them and they could disappear. Because of course, as long as there's been fairies, there's been someone trying to hunt them, capture them, get them to do their bidding, lasso them, whatever, try and get something out of them. It's kind of our human nature. What can we get out of this?
Awesome, thanks for sharing that. That's pretty cool. And you have a book, so Among the Mermaids, is that correct?
Yes, that's the book And there's some great little tidbits in there, there's Blackbeard, who was the most fearsome pirate, right? And really freaked. He used to put firecrackers in his beard to terrify his enemies. He was totally afraid of mermaids and would always order his ships to steer clear of anywhere that was considered mermaid infested waters, because he was afraid his lonely crew was going to just one side of mermaid torso and be over the edge there. But actually, if you think about that in a practical sense, especially if you know that some mermaid sightings were the first time anyone had seen a manatee or a dugong, because you had a lot of European sailors, they'd never seen anything like that. A dugong is like the southern hemisphere around New Zealand, and Australia you had these also manatee-like beings with these kind of supple, very large bodies and these, big tails that look a lot like the mermaid tails you see in old drawings. Yeah. And so Blackbeards, but manatees like shallow waters. So Blackbeard was onto something by ordering his crew sail away from shallow waters because you could run aground and you can't have that. So, and a lot of pirateering happened in the Caribbean and around the coast of Florida and the Carolinas, which is totally a area that you'd see manatees. So it makes sense. Not saying mermaids aren't real, just saying that was a good sound piece of advice that Blackbeard followed.
Yeah. Well, look, I've got you up. We're at an hour, or a little bit over, and I don't want to. Can I keep you a little bit longer, or?
Sure, we can go a little longer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Because I'm having fun, and I just feel bad because we've gone this far, and I want to talk a little bit about your Banshees, Werewolves, and Vampires book. Would you be able to just give us a little summary or a little overview of the book?
Yeah,
how you
sure.
attack it?
Yeah, well, it's about banshees, werewolves, and vampires. And there are some other creatures in there, although those creatures were explored more in kind of the next book. But the subtitle is Facts, Fictions, and First-Hand Accounts. And so it's a collection of stories that were, either experiences that people had in modern times, or old fairy and folk tales about these creatures, lore, legends, and then also some sort of scientific facts about it, like things that actually, there is actually a disease called lycanthropy that you can catch. And, well, I don't know if you can catch it, but you can have it. Yeah. And it drives someone to believe that they are a werewolf and to sort of like transform into an irrational, even more irrational being at the full moon. So that's kind of what the book is about. It explores banshees, then it explores werewolves, and then it explores vampires. And I think werewolves are absolutely fascinating. There are so many different cross-culturally different accounts of wolves and werewolves, and one of my favorite sources that I used for this book was by an Irish writer named Elliot O'Donnell, who in fact had inherited a banshee. And he was really interesting because a lot of those writers at the time were recording these stories and exploring things with a degree of cynicism. Like they were sort of recording it for the anthropological record. Elliot O'Donnell was different. He was an experiencer. And you can tell the difference when you read his work because I have a very old book I found in a rare, like a used bookstore here in kind of their rare book section, and it's Elliot O'Donnell's Book of Ghosts. And one of the first stories, he talks about being 8 years old and seeing a ghost. And so that really colored his lens. It really influenced his life. And so he was more of an investigator. Like many of the other, the Grimm brothers were traveling around and they were getting all these fairy tales. And Yeats was recording, the entire kind of like Celtic lexicon of the fairy kingdom. And O'Donnell was a little bit more into the 20th century, but he was writing about ghosts, banshees, and werewolves. And so one of his books about werewolves, he talks about these places that you can go and you can drink from the stream, and they were thought to be lycanthropic streams. And it was known by the locals that if you drank from these streams, you would transform into a werewolf, whether that was permanently or temporarily. Now, to me, that sounds like you drank some tainted water. Yeah. But he also talks about antidotes to lycanthropy growing right near the edge of the stream. So it's very interesting. Kind of, you could take this journey. I mean, it was almost like a shamanic experience that you could have in order to become a beast, in order to see what was happening in the wild natural world, and perhaps see how you can help survive the winter, or hunt, become a fearsome hunter, or go into battle. The berserkers were thought to also partake in some of these ritualistic drinks and herbs and things to kind of pump themselves up to go into this trance mode, to sort of like go berserk. And then there was another man who was very interesting. His name was he was Reverend, and he wrote the hymnal Onward Christian Soldiers. His name was Sabine Baring Gould. So he's really known for that sort of hymnal, but he actually wrote the longest book on werewolves in existence.
Really?
It's like this massive tome, and it's got this exploration of werewolves from around the world. And it's all, again, it's very colored with his reverendy lens. So he never says the locals are right. He basically, but it's very observational, and he had a very anthropological mind. And so he also did a lot of recording of what people told him. But he, unlike O'Donnell, who was really sort of like exploring and recording things, the Reverend was much more, he was more of a pontificator, I guess. And so he actually, and was also a philosopher. And so he had some really interesting things to say in his book. And one of them was that any of us could transform into a werewolf, because man has the capacity to murder in a rage. And anyone who has ever snapped out of anger can understand that there's a transformation from man to beast there. And that because of that, we all have the capacity to become a werewolf. A few other things maybe need to happen, to line up just right. Full moon, weird drugs, all that kind of stuff. But that we all have that capacity. One of the reasons this book is probably not that popular is he then goes on to say, take pregnant women, for example. And it's like, at that point, you're like, oh, okay, Reverend.
Yeah.
But the idea that you would have this hormonal change and it would kind of make you less capable of controlling that rage that we're all capable of. And that is also entirely possible, medically speaking. A hormonal imbalance can cause an excess of hair, and it can also cause an excess of depression, anger, rage. I think that proves the existence of werewolves, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But it was very, very interesting to go down that path with werewolves, because of course I was familiar with plenty of werewolf lore and the shape-shifting elements. But the idea of anyone being able to become a werewolf at any given time, that it wasn't a requirement that you be bit by a werewolf, but the other very interesting thing is that you had people were accused of being a werewolf, kind of in the Middle Ages, right? In the 1400s and 1500s, when like all the witches were being flushed out, so to speak. You also had, to a lesser degree, you had people being accused of being a werewolf or a vampire. Werewolf, vampire, or witch. Pick one. You're gonna, be burned, hung, or drowned. This is like, a horrible rubric there. But you definitely had some stories. Especially, there was a couple that have come over from the Middle Ages about like this. There's this one. It's in my book about this woman who. They find her. This is quite gruesome. So trigger warning for anyone who is doesn't want to hear about like brutal murder. So this woman is basically found. Somebody comes to the house the next day, and she's found sitting, sort of in this like pool of blood, and her husband is not just dead. He's like, his limbs are torn about and strewn about.
Wow.
And around her waist is found this pouch, and in this pouch there's a wolf's claw and like I think Wolf's Bane, which is aconite, which actually will make you go insane, and a couple of other things, which then of course causes the townspeople to declare that she's a werewolf and that she must be killed, and then of course she is killed. Probably conveniently, her land is, also worth something. Because that was another really common thread is like, oh, you're a little old lady with a bunch of land. Oh, you know what? You're a witch. A witch. I actually even heard a very interesting story about Madame Bathory, who is said to be this like vampiric woman who bathed in the blood of young maidens in her servitude in order to preserve her own beauty. And turns out she was the only heir to a very, very large estate, and the person who accused her of basically murdering all of her servants and abusing them was her cousin, her male cousin, who would have been the next in line to get the entire estate. So it puts a different spin on things. I can't say she wasn't doing that. And it's a lovely legend in a way. It's kind of what gave rise to a lot of what we know in like Bram Stoker's Dracula has elements of that in there. But yeah, conveniently, she had a lot of land that somebody else was able to take over and get the profits from.
Worked out.
Yeah, so always very interesting because there are some like real connections between the traditional ideas of werewolves, vampires, and witches. They have a lot of crossover.
Well, that sounds like a really fun book. I think people will enjoy that. So, some history.
It's like short little stories in there. So kind of all of my books are like that. You sort of just like flip them open and just read a section. You don't always have to read them from beginning to end. You might get a little Easter egg out of it if you read them from beginning to end, because I sometimes actually have a plan. But you can certainly flip them open and read it, at any place, and they're kind of designed to be like that. Because I love books like that. I love books that you can just sort of like amuse yourself for a few minutes while you're, waiting for your oil change or whatever mundane activity you must do.
Yeah, because how people, they're so busy, but they can carve out a couple minutes here and there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think. I'm obviously I'm a big reader, and I can spend weeks reading a novel or whatever. But I also recognize that sometimes you just want a little 5-minute story. 5-minute story is great. It's just like gets you out of. Actually, I think you enter fairy time. That's my real strong belief is that anytime you enter into that storytelling realm, you are entering into fairy time, and you're suspending your doubt. And when you suspend doubt, really amazing things happen. Amazing things happen in your brain, but also you come to understand that, other things are possible. So if I'm suspending my doubt long enough to hear a Bigfoot story, now that doesn't mean that I believe every word of it, but if it's a beautiful story, I'm there with it. And I totally believe with Bigfoot, by the way. But if I'm there, then what's to stop me from saying, honestly, like, just so I think that's where, like, that kind of innovative thinking, that's how we get the cure for cancer. We don't get it because we are distracted all the time. We get it because we think, hey, what if we tried this and this? And that's a suspension of doubt, and like something might happen if we do that. It's a belief. And I think that's the realm of the fairy, and that's where fairies really do their magic and their work, is within that weaving of, did I just see something out of the corner of my eye? I might have. And and children have that naturally, right? Like, you ask a kid to solve something, and they got a solution. They believe in these possibilities. They haven't been told that it's not possible. And so that's where like the really innovative things come out of that, whether it's a story idea or it's like a new medicine. Those things all come from innovative thinking. And so stories can really help us do that. Fairy tales can really help us do that. So if you take 5 minutes, and even if you read like something completely gruesome and horrifying, it's still taking you out of the present just long enough. You can time travel, right?
Right.
Like
right.
the only for sure example of time travel is in the pages of a book.
I love that. And so I hope people hear that, because what you're saying is take yourself to somewhere special. And these are ways to do it. To kind of open that up for yourself, and then, hey, solve a problem, come up with an invention, and just think of something special and different through those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And like that's, I mean, I work in a lot of writing groups, and we always talk about like this idea of writer's block and how to kind of like get past it, or how to like problem solve in a story that you're working on. And often the solution is to just read something else, to just do something else entirely different, and then amazing ideas come to you. I can't tell you how many writers and inventors I know say, well, I thought of something in the shower this morning. Something about the shower is always like our best ideas.
That's awesome. Before I let you go, I just want to mention a couple of these things so people know. We've got a few books here. I'm looking at fairies, pukas, and changelings, which we've dived into a little bit. Mm-hmm. Your paranormal parlor. Of course, we've been talking about Banshees, Wolverines, and yes, there you go.
There's the Banshees. The Banshees cover is pretty fabulous. So.
Yeah, I love that. And then you were saying one of your first books, was it the Bizarre, Book of the Bizarre? Is that
yeah,
right?
There's the Book of the Bizarre, and then the follow-up to that is Beyond Bizarre. Those are the first two. And then we have the Mermaid book. Basically, there's those two books of like freaky facts, and then there's three books that are about sort of like fairy and like supernatural creatures. One that's more ghost-based, and then, one that's coming out in April that's actually plant-based.
Plant-based, huh?
Yeah.
Are you able to talk about it or not yet?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, there's no like order link or anything for it, but however, there should be soon. There may be an order link by the time this is out.
Okay.
It's called Enchanted Plants, and it's a botanical treasury of folklore and magic. And what it is an exploration of plants as they appear in fairy tales and folklore. And it's kind of organized by plant, but it's sort of organized by like area. So you enter into the Queen's Garden, and you then go to the cottage garden, the kitchen garden, and then you go to the witch's garden. That's where all the poison plants are, all the fun stuff. Then you pass on to the woods and the meadows, and eventually you get to the sea. And so I've used very known stories as well as very obscure stories, many of which I just rewrote and retold, and along with medicinal and magical properties of every plant, and sort of plant or like the name, where the name came from, and what different cultures call the name, and how different cultures use that plant. So that's what it is, and it's very like kind of a crossover between that realm of the fairy and magic and plant medicine. So it's a really something that I just finished it, but I've honestly been working on that book for 20 years. So
wow.
It's like a cumulative of.
It's always been in the background being worked on.
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
And I learned so much writing that book. It was absolutely wonderful. Like, for example, I didn't know this, but Rapunzel is actually a plant. The Rapunzel is the German word for this particular kind of flower, also known as rampion. And it's this beautiful flower and the leaves are edible, and it grows everywhere, and it used to be widely cultivated in Germany. But it also grows wild in the forests. And so the Grimm brothers, that plant plays heavily in the beginning of that story, which is basically the whole reason she gets locked up with the witch in the tower, is because she's traded for unlimited rampion while the woman's pregnant. Like her unborn child is basically promised to this witch because she needs to have this rampion that's growing in the witch's garden. But the German word for it is Rapunzel, and that's where the Grimm brothers got the name for the story. So that was a really fun like I remembered the part about the plant in the beginning, but depending on what version and what translation, I'd never seen that it was actually the word Rapunzel was the German word for that plant. So that was kind of a fun thing to, like I said, I learned some very interesting things along the way too, especially in terms of like folklore and just kind of cool stories and very gruesome, strange versions of stories that you think you know, but you don't.
Right.
But involve, bloody shoes and eyes getting pecked out and all kinds of fun things like that. Delightful. Yeah. So, but it's a beautiful book. I saw reviewed the pages of it, and it's full color and illustrated, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So that will be out in April 1st, 2025. And I think usually they say at least 6 months before, what are we, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. But before Halloween, there should be a pre-order link for it.
Cool.
But it'll be on, anywhere. All my books are available wherever books are sold. So if you look at Varla Ventura, any local bookstore, bookshop.org, Amazon, all of those places have my book. And you can also check out my website, which is varlaventura.net.
Yes.
And I just use my name everywhere. So if you're looking for me on like Instagram or anything like that, as long as you know that there's V's, as in victory, involved, you'll be able to find me.
Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up here, and this has been great. Thank you for spending the extra little bit of time here to get into some of this, because this is great. I'm excited because people have the opportunity to, hey, there's it's Halloween time, and people think of your typical beasts and animals, but these topics that you cover in these books, awesome. So get some of that in.
Maybe Banshees will be the like Halloween costume of 2024.
Right. This is great stuff. So thank you for sharing, and people now know how to find your work. And we know that you have a book coming up. Any really long-term goals for anything, or is this?
There's another book I'm talking about with the publisher right now. So that we'll see where that goes. But I had a couple of ideas that I ran with them. So that's happening. I do have so I have this podcast that's called Midnight Stories, and I kind of use it to tell more in-depth stories that I sort of touch on in my books. So I have there's actually only one episode out right now, and that's about this really incredible woman of the paranormal who was her name is Ida Craddock, and she channeled all this incredible information. And anyway, so Midnight Stories. So I kind of just did that so I could use the writing that I had sort of ended up having to cut from books or things like that. So in the Paranormal Parlor book, I talk about this. There's a group in particular, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 different women that I discuss who really kind of broke out of the confines of Victorian society by using the occult and spiritualism, fortune telling, and all kinds of good stuff like that. So I'm kind of exploring those women in the podcast, just in like a little bit more depth. Their stories. A woman who channeled an entire novel via the Ouija board. That's like one of the best stories of all time. But I also have, so I could only fit so many plants in the book, and a lot of them were really, it was kind of about how much source material I could find built around that plant. And so I have probably 100 plants that didn't make it in that I have stories about. So the Midnight Stories will also, I'll start recording those soon, all of the sort of like little extra tidbits about strange plants and creepy fairy tales and things like that. So those will be coming out. hopefully by the time people are listening to this, there's already a couple that they can
Great.
listen to. So that's a long range goal, just for fun. It's just kind of something I want to just utilize those things. I'm not going to put all those plant stories into another book because I already
Sure.
did the book. So,
Sure.
but I don't, they're like amazing and fascinating, and so they, I want them to do something. I mean, if they're
Yeah.
interesting to me, that's kind of my, that's my rubric, I guess. It's like, well, if I find it interesting, then I wouldn't mind listening to this. Maybe there's like, I don't know, 6
Yeah.
other people and my family members who wouldn't mind listening to it too. And then there's all kinds of other like little cryptid stories and things like that. But the idea of Midnight Stories is really just a storytelling podcast that kind of, not storytelling so much in the fictional sense, but storytelling in the stories behind these kind of really cool discoveries that I've made doing my research.
That sounds great.
So,
And so,
we'll see how that goes.
where can people
I'm not
find
too
that?
techy, so
Yeah.
so it's everywhere except Apple right now. But actually, maybe by the time you're listening to it, I will have cracked the Apple code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I did it once, but I haven't been able to do it for the second episode. So, but yeah, you can just look up Midnight Stories. It's on like iHeartRadio and
Spotify, stuff like that.
yeah, Spotify, all of those things. I just haven't quite shoved it into the Apple Store yet.
Perfect.
Maybe
there
when
you go.
Mercury
You've
goes
given
direct, I
people-
can figure that.
You're giving people a host of cool books to check out and your podcast too. So
Yeah. Hopefully
People
that'll
are
be
set.
like, up and running here. Yeah.
yeah.
If you want more of me, you'll be sick of me. You'll be sick of me in a month.
Oh, it's great. This is great. I've enjoyed this so much. I know people are going to love this content. So let me say this, everybody. Varla Ventura. She's done a great interview here today, and she's given us good information about her books. And we've learned some stuff about some of these Banshees, pukas, things like that. Love it. Thank you for taking the time to do that for us. And, we can start building our library of these other items, these other animals, beasts, whatever you want to call them. Fairies. Are they all categorized fairies?
I mean, kind of. I would
Kind
say
of.
I wouldn't put werewolves and vampires
Yeah.
in that. I would put them in sort of like the supernatural, magical creature, greater realm. But certainly banshees, mermaids, pukas, changelings, they're all in the greater kingdom of the fairy kingdom. And it's kind of, I look at it like the plant kingdom, right? You got your like big, giant umbrella terms, and then all these little like, sub families and genus and species and all of that stuff. The fairy kingdom is very, very much like that. And I want to thank you. It's been a real delight getting to know you and just to talk to you. And I really enjoyed this. So I appreciate you giving me the time.
It's been great. So let me keep you for a minute after we end here just to wrap up. But for everybody else, it's Halloween time. Enjoy these things and really fill your mind, get into that special place with all these interesting stories, folklores, legends, and that sort of thing. But one thing you can't forget to do is to remember there's a lot of strange and unexpected out there. So keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.